everyone, my name is Mike Soskil and I am the 2017-2018 Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year, and I am the editor of a book that's coming out soon entitled Flip the System US: How Teachers Can Transform Education and Save Democracy. Summer 2020. What a time to be an American educator. I'm sure that many of you are feeling the stress and anxiety that I'm feeling right now as I think about going back to school next year. And as I think about school reopening plans and the decisions that are being made right now, I keep coming back to one fact that is most troubling to me. The decisions that impact our students most, in a lot of cases, are being made without input from the teachers who serve at the intersection of policy and practice. And what happens when teachers aren't fully involved in the decision-making process is that things are missed, and it results in unintended consequences for our students that are often not positive. And so what I want to talk to you about today is, in this time of great anxiety, when a lot of us are feeling powerless, how can we advocate for a flipped education system where every decision that impacts students is driven by the expertise of teachers? Before we can discuss any problem in education, we need to start with the question, what is the purpose of public education in our democracy? Because if we don't get that question right, then everything else that we're building on top of it, we get wrong. In the book that I have coming up, Geert Biesta describes a great model for what public education in a healthy democracy looks like. And you can see the graphic on your screen, and I'll explain it a little bit. Right now in the United States, we are hyper-focused on that top circle, on qualification. In the United States, we often refer to this as college and career readiness. It's the economic benefit of public school. We want our kids to be qualified to do something when they leave, whether it's be ready for a new career, whether it's to participate in the economy in some other way, whether it's to go to college so they can participate in the economy later on. This is the economic purpose of education. And we do this really well in the United States. But what we often miss are the other two circles that are equally as important. And because we haven't done a good job with those, we see some negative consequences in society. Socialization is the ability for students to understand how their unique identity fits in with the society that is educating them. And because we have not educated our kids to be able to have nuanced conversations, to be able to deal with complexity, to be able to understand systems, to be able to respectfully disagree with each other, practice with those kinds of conversations in school, we see those problems reflected in our society at large as well. We've largely ignored that. But even worse is our lack of focus on subjectification. This is the holistic well-being of students as individuals. This is helping our kids see who they are, what their passions are, how those passions intersect with the content that they're learning. It's helping kids find themselves and be well. We don't spend enough time doing this. We know that there are huge mental health issues in our schools, and they're not just the fault of education, although some of them are certainly caused by our education system. We don't take care of our children. And we also don't take care of our teachers, and teachers who are not well can't take care of kids. We know that before the pandemic, more than 50% of teachers were feeling incredible stress and anxiety and depression due to their job. And we know that there is a huge teen suicide crisis in our schools right now and in our society. Those are all a reflection of the things that we're not getting right. And so in order to discuss what public education should look like, we have to come to an understanding that all three of these things need to be in balance going forward. In order to build an education system that serves healthy democracy in that way, we need to flatten the hierarchy. So right now, if you look at the left side of the screen, you will see that our current education system is hierarchical and top-down and coercive. And it's rigid. There's not a whole lot of moving parts. The federal government tells states what to do, and then they use certain levers to try and force them to do them. States do the same thing to local school boards. School boards do that to their administrators, and then administrators do the same thing to us as teachers. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that that model continues in our classrooms, and teachers use coercive measures to try and get students to do what they're told. We use extrinsic motivators like grades. We use certain rule structures and discipline policies that try and get kids to comply rather than to see themselves as owners of the learning process and as active participants in school. And in my chapter in the book, one of the things that I write about is a lot of our school mission statements talk about the need for us to develop good citizens in society. But in our schools and classrooms, we don't give kids the opportunity to practice that. Democracy can't develop, it can't thrive where it's absent. And so expecting children to magically graduate at the age of 17 or 18 as good democratic citizens when we've given them no opportunity to learn how to be good democratic citizens of their own classrooms or schools is unrealistic. So what we're trying to move to is a flipped education system where all of those different stakeholders see themselves as partners in learning. We want it to be fluid and supportive. And so it starts with teachers asking students in the community, what do you need to be successful and how can I support you? And getting that authentic qualitative feedback from the stakeholders that we're trying to serve. And once we've done that, we can then demand of our administrators the same thing, that they ask the same question, what do you need to be successful and how can I support you? And if we create that kind of flattened hierarchy, we can start moving to an educational model where decisions are being made based on information that's coming from the intersection of policy and practice. It's coming from the collective expertise of teachers in the classroom. And there are less unintended consequences and poor decisions being made that impact our students. Now, on the last slide, I mentioned that we're trying to get the collective expertise of teachers to drive information decisions. And that word collective is really important. What we're after in the education profession to get this right is collective autonomy. Of course, we want some amount of individual autonomy, but individual autonomy is great in some ways. It allows us to make creative decisions in our own classrooms based on our knowledge of our students and our expertise. It allows us to make good curriculum decisions. But the danger in only relying on individual autonomy is that some teachers are going to do some stupid stuff. We know that it happens. Some teachers are going to do some stuff that is bad for kids. And we want to prevent that. We want to make sure that that is happening as infrequently as possible, and none if we can have it. We want to eliminate it if possible. So what I'm calling for in a flipped education system, and Melissa Tomlinson writes about this brilliantly in her chapter in the book, is that we're trying to develop a collective autonomy where the teaching profession collectively is driving education decisions. And what this means is that we are developing the standards by which we're going to be judged. You would never want heart surgery being evaluated by people who have no knowledge of what happens when people do heart surgery, right? You wouldn't want politicians and construction men making decisions about heart surgery procedures and standards, in the same way that you don't want textbook companies and politicians and lobbyists making decisions based on what good teaching looks like. You want teachers coming together to develop those standards and holding others accountable by those standards that were developed by teachers. And so what we're really looking for is for the teaching profession to have collective autonomy over the decisions that are being made. So let's briefly talk about 5 things that we can do to create the kind of education system that will support a healthy democracy. And the first is giving our students autonomy and agency over learning and over some of the things that happen in our schools so that they can learn to be good democratic citizens to support democracy. I have a good friend in the UK who I write about in my chapter, Sean Bellamy. He started the SAND School, which is a school based on democratic principles. Every decision in that school is made through the democratic process between teachers and students. And teachers and students there's no hierarchy or level there. They all have a vote. So whether it's painting the classroom, whether someone wants to paint the classroom green, or whether it's a determination of whether a teacher gets hired or fired, it is all done democratically. And I know it's hard to wrap your head around that process, but I want to share a story from that school that exemplifies what this looks like. So they're obviously trying to teach democracy. It's a school based on democratic principles. And one of the things that happened is they realized that kids were coming to classes late. Students were coming late because they were visiting a convenience mart that was near the school. And so a group got together, a group of decision makers who were on that committee, whatever committee oversaw that, and they decided that they were going to put a school rule in place that nobody was allowed to go to the convenience mart during school hours from then on. And then, because they were hungry after that meeting, they all went to the convenience mart to go get a snack. And the next day they realized what a foolish decision that was. The problem wasn't the convenience mart. The problem was that kids were being disrespectful and they were interrupting the learning process of others. And so what they did after they realized their mistake is they changed the rule. They got together and through the democratic process, they changed the rule so that kids, when they came into class, had to be respectful. And if they disrupted the learning process, teachers were allowed to ban them from class for the rest of the period. And that solved the problem. And the point I want to illustrate from that story is that in a normal school setting where democracy is absent, this rule would have come from central administration or from administration somewhere in the building. It would have been dictated down. There would have been unintended consequences from that policy, and they never would have gotten fixed. And more importantly, students never would have learned about what it takes to be a leader and to make good democratic decisions. So the more we can turn over democratic decision-making process in, whether it's within learning, whether it's within creating classroom norms to our students, the more we can do that, the more we can prepare them to be better decision makers and better democratic citizens going forward. Next, we have to design an education system that serves all students. Because if education doesn't serve all, then all students are not equally prepared to participate in democracy, and a democracy that is not inclusive is not a democracy. And so this needs to start with us as teachers, making sure that we are inclusive in our educational practices, recognizing our internal biases and how they're impacting our students, but also advocating outside of our classrooms for a more equitable education system. I don't think anything has exposed in my teaching career has exposed the inequities in education to the broader public any more than the pandemic that has just happened. It was obvious what students were able to still be served through remote teaching after schools started shutting down. And I can speak from a purely Pennsylvania standpoint. Affluent school districts were instantly ready to go back. Education wasn't exactly the same, but they were able to transition to remote learning pretty quickly, and kids were still learning new material, and they had the resources to be able to provide internet access and devices to kids. Whereas poorer districts that generally serve higher minority populations, more Black students, more Hispanic students, were not in the position to be able to do that in the same way. We have to make sure that there is equitable access to quality education for all students. And we need to make sure that our practices in our classrooms reflect that. And as I mentioned before, we want the collective expertise of teachers driving education decisions. But if our teaching force is predominantly white and female, there are going to be biases that come through in the information that's given to decision makers. And so we have to focus on diversifying our teaching force so that it reflects our students also, in addition to focusing on classroom practices. Next, as I mentioned before, we have to make sure we're focusing on the holistic well-being of students. This is the subjectification. We need to make sure that our students know their self, who they are, but also that they are mentally well, socially well, emotionally well. And this means that they have access to a rich curriculum of arts and music and dance, and that our subjects are not isolated and disconnected from each other, that they're contextualized, and that there's connections to their local and global communities, and they're able to use information to solve problems in their community. And this is really important during the pandemic. As most of you that were in classrooms know, our students have gone through a period of trauma. A lot of them are not well in the same way that we're not well. And so right now, it is critical that we have a focus on their social emotional health. This means that the most important thing that we do now, just like always, is going to be build relationships with our students, understand who they are, and understand what their needs are. We have to make sure that we are meeting their basic needs before we start teaching them the curriculum. And good teachers have always known this. But it also means that we as teachers need to advocate for that in our school systems. So as we start shifting to whatever school looks like next year in our districts, we have to fight for the arts. We have to fight for social emotional learning for our students. We have to fight for trauma-informed practices, to push for school counselors and nurses in every building. When you look at collective action and what it means to advocate for kids. One of my favorite examples is what happened in Chicago a couple years ago. All of us are familiar with the Red for Ed movement, but Chicago teachers were not striking for higher wages or better healthcare, although I'm sure that was part of what they were looking for. But when you look at their platform, when you look at what they were speaking about, when they were out talking to the media and when they were striking, they were fighting for school psychologists, for mental health workers, for nurses in every building. They were fighting for this, for the social emotional well-being of their students. If we're not doing that right, we are not preparing students for success later on outside of our schools, and we are not preparing them to take over this democracy from us and make it stronger than what it is right now. Number 4 is we have to be ready to step into some uncomfortable roles. I know you're tired. I know you're exhausted. I am too. But if we don't do it, nobody else will. And one of the things that we have to understand about our job is that we are in a political profession. We've all heard teachers say, I'm not really into politics. I don't really get involved in that. If you know that something is good for your students and it is not happening, if you know that something is good for public education and it's not happening, if you know that something is good for your colleagues and the teaching profession and you are not doing something about it, then you are complicit in allowing those bad things to happen. It is our moral and ethical responsibility to step into political spaces, to make sure that those who are making decisions know exactly what is going on in our schools so that they can make better decisions. If we allow them to only hear from lobbyists and textbook companies and corporations and those who have a vested interest in using public education for their own good rather than our students' good, and we are not at the table fighting for our kids, then nobody will, and we will end up with a system that is unhealthy and that is doing some pretty horrible things to our children. We cannot allow that to happen. We have to be willing to advocate and to step into some new roles. And this means that we have to do it collectively, right? Any one of us by ourselves will get quashed. We need to make sure that we have solidarity and that we are taking collective action to advocate for what we know is right in public education. And finally, in order to do all of these things that I talked about, we need professional development and professional learning. And we need to demand that from those in the system above us right now. That needs to be part of flattening the hierarchy. But we also need to take control of our own professional development. We need to be professionals in that manner. And one of the things that I love about the 4 or 5 chapters that are in this section of the book is that they focus on how to do this in different ways. So there's a section on democratized professional development and ed camps, and how teachers have banded together outside of their school districts to demand professional development opportunities and to create these opportunities where they are getting exactly what they need from the professional learning experience. There's another chapter on how we build an education system that supports teachers from all backgrounds, because we know that teachers that come from historically oppressed backgrounds have a tough time becoming teachers. Back in 2016, there were over 4,000 teacher certifications that were given out in the state of Pennsylvania. Only 26 of them were for Black males. If we don't diversify our education force, and we can't support all teachers, regardless of what backgrounds they come from, and to not just respect their background, but to celebrate that background and how it brings diversity to our students and different perspectives to our students, if we can't do that, we're not going to be able to get education right. And so we need to build a system that allows teachers to take control of their own professional development, but also provides support for teachers in all of those different ways. And so it is our job to both seek out those opportunities and also to advocate for a better system. Noah Carvelis, in his chapter in Flip the System, writes about how the Red for Ed movement started in Arizona. And what he talks about is that it wasn't teachers who were brought together by any outside agency. It wasn't unions that came and organized teachers. It wasn't schools or politicians. Teachers got together and they said, this is unacceptable what we're seeing. We need to get together and fight for something that is better. And through that grassroots movement, they built a coalition that then started to include those outside agencies like unions and like politicians and others who were willing to support. But it started with teachers coming together and saying, enough. This is not acceptable anymore. Grassroots advocacy is always more powerful than financial donations. It's more powerful than corporate interests. It's more powerful than those who are trying to use public education for their own means. We can do this. No one else is going to do it for us, but we can do this if we come together and speak with one voice and fight for what we know is right. There is so much more detail that I want to go into and so many more stories that I want to share with you. But unfortunately, I only have a little bit of time. But in Flip the System, you can see there are 32 amazing authors. Many of them are teachers. We have students that write about their experiences. We have some of the leading educational researchers in the world. Pasi Sahlberg writes about what the United States can learn from other international education systems, including the system he helped design in Finland. These authors have an incredible amount of expertise, and each of them brings a diverse perspective to the question of how can we create an education system that supports democracy and is inclusive for all. And so as much as I would love to share each one of their stories with you, it is much better for you to read them for yourself. Finally, I want to leave you with this quote from Hillel the Elder. You can read it for yourself, but the general gist you know already. If not us, then who? And if not now, then when? It's time for us to rise up and to demand the kind of education system that serves all students and is driven by the expertise of teachers. If we do that, we can get education right. And if we get education right, we can get our democracy right. Thank you so much for taking some time with me today. If you have any questions or want to contact me, my contact information is on the screen. The book is now available for pre-order. It'll ship early in this fall. You can see the link on your screen. But thank you for what you do. Thank you for the amazing job that you do for students. And thank you for the work that you're going to do in a time of great chaos and unrest and anxiety and stress for all of us in society. In this American society. Thank you for the work that you're going to do this fall and beyond to make sure that our students are well and that they're getting the best education that is possible in this crazy time.